I never thought I'd see a grown woman in high heels sprinting across my freshly tilled field, shrieking into her cell phone about code violations. Yet there I was leaning on my shovel, watching it all unfold like some bizarre matinee performance. The wind carried the smell of overturned earth and newly cut hay, blending with the frantic echo of her voice. At my side stood Deputy Herman and his partner, Officer Gurez, both with equally bewildered looks on their faces. "Should we stop her?" Officer Gutierrez asked in a low voice. I shrugged, biting back a grin. She's going to stop herself soon enough. I'd known Karen for a couple of months. Didn't know her actual name, mind you, but the neighborhood's nickname for her stuck like glue. She was the self-appointed president of the brand-spanking new Homeowners Association that sprouted up just across the county road from my family's farm. Over the last year, a developer had turned acres of once wild meadows into cookie-cutter houses with perfectly manicured lawns. And with them came the dreaded HOA. My farmland, by contrast, had been in my family for 5 generations. We'd seen neighbors come and go. People tried their hand at rural living, only to pack up when they discovered cows didn't come with an off switch for mooing at 2 in the morning. But this new HOA crowd was different. They didn't seem to realize they were the newcomers. Instead, they treated us like we were the intruders. Today's drama started at dawn. I was in the barn, going about my normal routine, when Karen showed up unannounced. She marched right in, ignoring the no trespassing sign nailed to the fence, and started snapping photos on her phone. "You are in direct violation of several community standards," she'd announced. Her voice rang out like an angry schoolteacher scolding a class. "I'll be writing you a formal citation." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "Ma'am," I replied, "I don't live in your subdivision. I own this land. Your HOA rules don't apply here. You're adjacent to the development," she snapped, jabbing a finger at me. "And the smell of your livestock crosses property lines. That puts you under our jurisdiction." That was a new one. I wiped my hands on my jeans and asked politely, "Could you show me where it says that in your bylaws?" Karen rummaged through her leather-bound folder, flipping pages like a gambler going through a deck of cards. Finding nothing relevant, she insisted she'd be back with more evidence. Before stomping off, she threatened to call the authorities if I didn't remove the unregistered animals from her precious environment. I brushed it off, until about an hour later when I saw the swirl of red and blue lights creeping up my driveway. Figuring Karen had made good on her threat, I walked out to meet the patrol car. Instead of some stern official, it was Deputy Herman, who often stopped by for coffee or fresh eggs. Behind him was Officer Gutierrez, a newcomer still getting the lay of the land. "Now, I don't mean to surprise you on a Monday morning," Herman said, hitching his belt, "but we got a report of a wildly unsafe farm operation. Your name came up." "Well, at least she's creative," I replied. "Seems like a new HOA lady has me in her crosshairs." "She sure does," Herman said, shaking his head. "But we know you better than that. We're out here because we've got official business in the neighborhood. Anyway, thought we'd swing by and check that everything's okay." That was when Karen emerged from behind an old oak, phone in hand, snapping pictures as if collecting evidence for a court case. She saw the squad car, saw me chatting with the officers, and apparently decided her moment had come. She aimed the phone at Herman and demanded, "Arrest him. He's in violation of at least 10 different property codes." It was so comical, I almost felt sorry for her. Herman explained, in his calm, patient tone, that I wasn't in any kind of violation. He also gently reminded her that his jurisdiction was the entire county and not beholden to an HOA's internal policies. Karen didn't care. She dialed 911 right there on the spot, not realizing the men she wanted dispatched were literally standing in front of her. That's when things got truly bizarre. The moment she started screaming into the phone about animal endangerment and weapons on the premises, "I do own a licensed shotgun, but it's locked up," she locked eyes with Gutierrez and froze. In that instant, it dawned on her. The backup she was summoning had already arrived, and they weren't on her side. With stony faces, Herman and Gutierrez demanded she hang up the phone. She refused. She stomped her foot, shrieking about her rights. Then, in one swift gesture, Herman reached over and ended the call for her, explaining that misuse of 911 was a serious offense. Karen's fury shifted from me to them. Her words flew out in an incomprehensible rant about how this whole county is corrupt, how the rules don't apply to country folk, and how nobody respects the law but me. She must have forgotten that, in addition to checking on me, the officers had come out here for an entirely different reason. Her. I let out a slow whistle, resting a hand on my old barn cat who'd wandered over. The stage was set. Karen had no idea, but she was about to find herself on the receiving end of a real, official inquiry, one that had absolutely nothing to do with me or my animals. The chaos died down for a moment as Herman asked Karen to step aside and answer a few questions. She refused, her eyes darting around my property like she expected a reality TV crew to jump out from behind the tractor. In the meantime, Officer Gutierrez ambled over to me. "Sorry about this," he whispered. "This isn't exactly the good morning I planned on having." "Don't worry about it," I replied, patting the barn cat. "You're doing your job." Gutierrez nodded. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "We actually came here to talk to her about something else. We've had multiple complaints, threats, harassment, possible financial misconduct. When she made that 911 call, we realized we'd better step in before things escalated." It all clicked. Over the last month, I'd heard whispers from folks in the new subdivision. They told me how their neat lawn paradise came with a pricey monthly HOA fee. Karen, apparently, was the self-proclaimed enforcer of every obscure rule, from no bird baths in front yards to approved paint swatches only. But rumors circulated about where those funds were going and why nobody ever got to review official statements. A neighbor confided that Karen had threatened to foreclose on his house for painting his porch the wrong shade of beige. Another said she'd raised HOA dues without any formal vote. Now it seemed the sheriff's department had enough complaints to launch a full investigation. "She's truly stuck her foot in it then," I murmured. Karen, oblivious to the conversation between me and Gutierrez, was mid-rant at Herman. Her voice carried on the breeze. "My father was a prosecutor, so I know how these things work. You can't just come onto my property. This is trespassing. I'll sue you. I'll sue the county. Herman's posture remained stoic. He was a gentle giant of a man, 6'3", slow to anger, with a deep baritone that could calm most situations. I'd seen him diffuse bar fights with nothing but a few words and a raised eyebrow. But Karen's bluster seemed to test even his patience. "Ma'am," Herman said, his voice tight but measured, "we're not on your property. We're on his." He gestured at me. "And we're here because you called 911 to report a non-emergency. That's a problem." She threw her arms up. "A non-emergency? He's got animals running amok. Chickens, horses, and don't even get me started on the smell." Herman's gaze flicked over to my stable. A couple of curious horses peered out, tails swishing lazily, clearly not rampaging through the neighborhood. "As far as I see," Herman said, "everything here is up to code for farmland. This is an agricultural zone, and you have no jurisdiction over it, HOA or not." Her face, pinched and red, looked close to bursting. "Well, then I demand you come with me to my neighborhood, my domain, where real crimes are happening. People are building unauthorized sheds. They're unapproved garden gnomes." At that, I couldn't help but cough to hide a laugh. Gutierrez caught my eye, his own lips twitching in barely contained amusement. But Herman simply nodded. "We do intend to head back over there, ma'am, but for other reasons. We need to speak with you in an official capacity regarding some allegations. Financial misconduct, harassment, intimidation." Karen blanched. "That's ridiculous." "Perhaps," Herman said, "but we need your cooperation. So why don't we settle things here and then?" "No," Karen barked, stepping away from him. "I see what's happening. You've teamed up with this backward farmer to turn people against me." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He's probably bribing you with free eggs and cheese to ruin my reputation." I raised my hands, a gesture of mock surrender. "Lady, I promise, I'm not paying anybody off with cheese." She didn't believe me, of course. Her eyes darted around the driveway, scanning for an escape route. When Herman tried to gently guide her back to his patrol car, she spun on her heel, nearly twisting an ankle in her stilettos, and took off running toward the new development. For a moment, it looked like she might lose a shoe in the loose gravel. Gutierrez sighed. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. He gave chase, jogging after her. Herman glanced my way, shaking his head in disbelief before following suit. They both vanished into the dust clouds kicked up by her frantic sprint, leaving me and the barn cat in stunned silence. I exhaled, leaning against the fence. I'd lived long enough to see my share of run-ins with folks who think farmland belongs in a museum, not next door to their suburban dream. Usually, we find a compromise. They get used to the roosters crowing, and I keep my property line neat. But Karen? She was a different breed. She seemed dead set on turning the entire countryside into her personal fiefdom. While the lawman disappeared over the crest of my driveway, I set aside my shovel and walked toward the stable. My oldest horse, a graying mare named Bess, nickered softly in greeting. The morning's excitement had already set me behind schedule. We had hay bales to unload and feed troughs to clean. But worry nibbled at the back of my mind. The cops might catch her, but that didn't necessarily mean the situation would be resolved. If Karen refused to cooperate, this entire fiasco could drag out for weeks, maybe months. Meanwhile, the other homeowners in that pristine development would be stuck in limbo, dealing with her meltdown and questionable leadership. Let's see how far she gets, I murmured to Bess. She'll trip over her own ego eventually. I could only imagine the scene playing out a half-mile down the road. Karen, breathless, shrieking about codes and conspiracies, Herman and Gutierrez calmly instructing her to face the facts. If she had truly embezzled HOA funds or engaged in intimidation, they wouldn't just take her word for it. They want documents, witnesses, logs of all those inflated fees. Everyone who'd filed complaints would likely line up to share their stories. For the moment, though, I was simply relieved she was no longer invading my land. I was free to return to my normal routine, though I suspected normal was a thing of the past as long as that woman was involved. And deep down, a small part of me felt a twinge of pity. Whatever her reasons, power trip, desperation, or some misguided sense of control, Karen was about to learn that out here in the country, we don't take kindly to troublemakers. And the authorities? Well, they were already on her trail, with or without her frantic 911 call. 2 days passed without any further drama, at least on my side of the fence. I went about my chores, mindful of every sound that might signal Karen's return. Each time a car engine rumbled on the gravel road, I half expected that shrill voice demanding to see my permit for the barn. But no such luck. Things stayed quiet. Then, on a bright Thursday morning, my old friend, retired teacher Miss Ethel, came to pick up a dozen eggs. She lived in the subdivision. She'd downsized from her big farmhouse after her husband passed and had chosen one of the new senior-friendly homes. Between sips of lemonade, she confided that the neighborhood was in an uproar. You remember that nice couple, the Millers? Well, they're missing hundreds of dollars. Karen fined them for landscape infractions, but never gave him a receipt. And when they asked the HOA treasurer about it, he said he'd never seen the check. I shook my head. That's theft, plain and simple. It gets worse, Miss Ethel continued, clucking her tongue. She threatened to get their house repossessed if they went public. But they went straight to the sheriff anyway. A handful of others did too. They found out she's not been depositing HOA checks into the official account. And guess where the money went? I raised an eyebrow. Her personal account. Ding, 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 Miss Ethel said. That's what I hear, at least. The police are investigating. She's in a heap of trouble. Talk of immediate removal from her presidency. But it's been hush-hush. The developers are worried about negative publicity scaring off potential buyers. If that's all true, I replied, she's looking at serious charges. Not just harassment. Miss Ethel nodded sagely. Serve her right for trying to bully folks. But that's not all. She paused for emphasis. Somebody found out she's been forging signatures, claiming there was a vote to raise dues. She even made it look like the community voted to allow her to collect a salary for her role. Now that's some real nerve, I said, letting out a low whistle. Karen, it seemed, was playing a dangerous game, one that had begun to catch up with her. The day she tried to strong-arm me with her, "You're under our jurisdiction," nonsense, she must have believed she could do no wrong. But the law around here is straightforward. If you cheat people, you face the consequences. I figure it was only a matter of time before she found herself in handcuffs. Sure enough, that very afternoon, Deputy Herman's car rolled into my driveway. This time, though, he wasn't alone. A second squad car pulled up behind him. I set down my tools and walked over to greet them. "What's going on?" I asked, glancing from Herman to the other officer, a tall woman I recognized as Sergeant Albright. Herman sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his short hair. "We've got new evidence against Karen. Embezzlement, extortion, you name it. We were hoping you might have some security footage of the day she trespassed on your property." "Security footage?" "I've got an old camera set up by the barn to watch for coyotes, but it might have caught part of her little rampage." "Why?" "It could help us establish a pattern of behavior," Albright explained. "We're building a case. If she's brazen enough to trespass and call 911 for a non-issue, it fits the larger picture that she abuses her perceived authority. And that 911 call was made under false pretenses. Our dispatch recorded everything." I nodded. "I'll go pull the memory card. You want to see it now?" "We'd appreciate it," Herman said. "We also came by to let you know we might execute a search warrant in the subdivision soon. If Karen tries to come onto your property again, give us a call immediately." I retrieved the footage, fast-forwarded to the relevant portion, and sure enough, the camera had captured Karen charging onto my land that morning, snapping photos, and eventually hollering at me about codes. The audio quality wasn't great, but you could still hear her screeching about how the smell of cow manure crosses property lines, so it's an HOA violation. Herman and Albright exchanged looks that said it all. They had more than enough reason to keep digging into her questionable tactics. Sergeant Albright thanked me and said, "She's not going to be able to talk her way out of this, you know. The evidence is piling up. These folks who filed complaints, some of them are seniors living on fixed incomes. She bled them dry for phony violations. That's not just unethical, it's criminal." I felt my anger rise. Rural communities look out for elders. We do what we can to keep them safe. Hearing that Karen targeted some of the older residents who couldn't fight back easily, that made my blood boil. I hope she gets exactly what's coming to her. "Us too," Herman agreed. And with that, they climbed back into their cars and headed out. I turned around to find my wife, Annie, standing on the porch, arms crossed. She'd watched the conversation unfold from the screen door. "Looks like the net's tightening," she said softly. "Sure does," I replied. "And I doubt Karen's going down without a fight." A wry smile crossed Annie's face. People like that usually don't. We spent the rest of the day in a subdued rhythm, tending to animals, repairing fence posts, mowing the tall grass along the ditch. But beneath it all was the hum of anticipation. A storm was brewing on the other side of the road. That evening, Annie and I shared a quiet dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh green beans from our garden. The conversation inevitably circled back to Karen. "Reckon she'll try something else?" Annie asked, pushing aside her empty plate. "She's cornered," I said, swirling my iced tea. "And cornered animals lash out. But if the cops are half as serious as they seem, Karen won't get far." "Hope you're right. I like to keep living peacefully on our farm." Annie reached across the table for my hand. I squeezed back, the familiar calluses of farm life a small comfort. No matter how big a nuisance Karen was, we'd endure. Our family had seen droughts, floods, and even a tornado that flattened half the barn. This was just another storm in a teacup. Though I couldn't help suspecting that Karen's final act might be the most dramatic yet. The question was whether or not she'd drag anyone else down with her when she fell. Outside, night settled over the fields. The horses whinnied softly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped at the rising moon. I finished my tea, turned off the porch light, and stared across the road. The HOA's rows of identical houses glowed with porch lamps and decorative lanterns. It all looked so tranquil, but I knew better. When you scratch beneath a perfect lawn, sometimes you find a whole mess of worms. The next morning, the storm broke, just not in the way anyone expected. I was up at dawn, hauling feed to the chickens. It was still cool, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. My boots crunched on the gravel path, accompanied by the soft clucking of hens. For a moment, it felt peaceful again. Then I heard shouting. Not the furious shrill of Karen this time, but a deeper, authoritative voice. I hurried to the driveway in time to see two unmarked cars parked behind a squad car, their headlights cutting through the early light. Standing at the edge of the road was Sergeant Albright, flanked by Herman and a plainclothes officer I didn't recognize. They were focused on Karen, who stood defiant just outside the entrance of the subdivision. She wore a wrinkled blouse and looked like she hadn't slept. "What's all this about?" I asked softly, sidling up to Herman. The officers had formed a loose circle around Karen, who clutched a folder to her chest as if it were armor. "We have a warrant," Albright said. "We tried to serve at her home. She came running out, yelling that we had no right. She's refusing to hand over HOA financial records." Karen let out a hysterical laugh. "Those records are private property. You can't just barge in and take them." Albright lifted the warrant. "Actually, we can. Court approved. There's enough probable cause for investigation into grand larceny, fraud, and extortion." For a long moment, Karen stared at the official document, her face caught between rage and fear. Then she turned toward me, jabbing a finger in my direction. "This is your doing, you and your backward farm. If you just followed HOA guidelines, none of this would have happened." I blinked. "Ma'am, you realize you're the one under investigation, right? My chickens didn't cause you to siphon HOA money into your bank account." She pointed at Herman next, her voice trembling. "You're all in on it. This is a conspiracy. My HOA neighbors complained about me because they can't handle rules. They lie, cheat, and—" "Enough," Albright said firmly. "We have copies of the checks, the forged signatures, the deposit slips into your personal account." Karen's tirade stopped mid-sentence. The color drained from her face. I could almost see the fight or flight switch flicker in her eyes. Fight was losing ground to flight. It's not what it looks like," Karen mumbled. "I was just collecting overdue fines." "Then let us see the official ledger," Albright insisted. "Show us a record of every transaction, every deposit that lines up with your story." Karen refused to unlock her folder. Instead, she spun around and tried to flee back into the subdivision. But this time, Officer Gutierrez was ready. He stepped forward, blocking her path as two more officers emerged from behind one of the unmarked cars, effectively cornering her. She froze, folder clutched tight. "Karen Phillips," Albright said, a note of finality in her voice. "You're under arrest for suspicion of embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of emergency services." She motioned for Herman to handcuff the woman. Karen let out a strangled cry, dropping the folder. Papers spilled onto the asphalt, bank statements, copies of checks, threatening letters to various residents. I stared at the damning evidence scattered like leaves in a storm. My mind flicked back to the day she first showed up on my land with her citations and her unwavering certainty that she could control me, just as she controlled everything else in her domain. Now, that domain was unraveling around her. As Herman cuffed her, Karen twisted her head to hurl one last accusation my way. "I'll sue you for defamation. You set me up." I shook my head, arms crossed. "No, ma'am. You set yourself up the day you decided you could boss around the entire county." She struggled, but Albright and Herman were professionals. They secured her in the back of the squad car as the plainclothes officer collected the spilled documents. A small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered at a safe distance, some clutching coffee mugs, bathrobes flapping in the breeze. Many looked relieved. A few whispered "good riddance" under their breath. One elderly couple I recognized from the feed store actually started clapping. When the cars pulled away, quiet settled like a thick blanket over the subdivision. Only then did I realize I was shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. It's not every day you witness an arrest at your doorstep, let alone an arrest that you'd seen coming for weeks. I slowly walked back toward my farm, the sun fully risen now, casting warm light across the fields. The chickens squawked indignantly, wondering why I hadn't brought their morning feed. I resumed my chores, each motion oddly calming. dumping feed into the trough, scattering grain, cleaning the waterers. Life on the farm has a reassuring routine. No matter what storms blow in from the outside world, animals still need tending, fields still need plowing, and seeds still need sowing. Over the next few weeks, the story of Karen's downfall spread through the county like wildfire. The local paper ran headlines about HOA president accused of embezzlement. Folks who'd been victims of her intimidation came forward with receipts, forged documents, and tearful testimonies. It turned out she'd pocketed thousands of dollars, money she used for vacations, designer clothes, you name it. And all along, she acted like she was enforcing the letter of the law. In the aftermath, the rest of the HOA scrambled to reorganize. A new board was elected, one that promised transparency and a more neighborly approach. Some older residents who'd considered selling their homes decided to stay, now that the cloud of Karen's tyranny was gone. I even got a thank you note from Miss Ethel, who wrote that she could finally put up her little stone angel statue in the front yard without fear of a fine. As for me and my farm, we continue on the way we always have. The morning after Karen's arrest, I woke up at sunrise, walked outside, and took a deep breath of sweet air, manure and all. That's the smell of freedom, I like to say. Freedom to cultivate the land, raise my animals, and live life without some meddling busybody telling me how high my grass can grow. I still see Officer Gutierrez from time to time. He stops by to buy fresh eggs. Deputy Herman remains a friend of the family. His wife now volunteers at our local library, and we sometimes share a pot of coffee or cold lemonade on hot afternoons. We talk about the old days, the changing face of the county, and the surprising resilience of small communities. From what I hear, Karen is facing a string of charges that could put her behind bars for years. Whether she'll get a plea deal or face a trial is anyone's guess. But one thing is for sure, she won't be calling 911 on my farm ever again. She learned the hard way that when you cry wolf about unapproved livestock, all while running your own racket, eventually the real authorities show up, and they're not there to do your bidding. Sometimes I'll stand by the fence, watching the new houses in that subdivision across the way. I like to imagine that, in time, they'll settle into a peaceful rhythm of rural life. Neighbors helping neighbors, kids riding bikes, folks gathering for barbecue potlucks. If they do, I'll be here, just on the other side of the road, carrying on the family tradition as my grandparents and great-grandparents did before me. It's a funny thing. Farmland and suburbs can coexist just fine, so long as there's respect and a willingness to adapt. So that's the story of how HOA Karen tried to call 911 on my farm, not realizing the cops were actually out here for her. It's a cautionary tale, I suppose, about greed, arrogance, and picking the wrong battle, especially in a place where the land has deeper roots than any homeowner's manual. Because out here, we look out for each other, and we sure don't take kindly to bullies, no matter how official they claim to be. The end.